Her hands would not stop shaking as she climbed the last switchback of Hermit's Ridge, and she told herself it was only the cold, though the afternoon sun lay warm across the pines, and there was no wind at all. Naomi Strand had carried baskets up worse trails than this one, delivering mending and mourning black to families scattered across the high country around Millbrook, and she had never once turned back on a delivery in 9 years of dressmaking. She did not turn back now. But her feet had gone slow and strange beneath her, because the boy who fetched wood for Reverend Prout had said the hermit up on the ridge had a bad leg, and a face folk didn't like to look at too long, and something in the way he'd said it had lodged like a splinter under Naomi's ribs and would not come out, not on the whole long climb from town. She saw the cabin before she saw the man, a low, sound structure of notched logs, better built than any recluse's shack had a right to be, a neat stack of split wood along one wall in a garden gone half to seed for want of a second pair of hands. Smoke stood up straight from the chimney into the still air. Then the door opened, and a man came out onto the step favoring his left leg badly, a rifle held loose and easy in one scarred hand, and Naomi stopped walking altogether, her basket of mending forgotten against her hip. She would have known him if he'd been gone 40 years instead of 7. The beard was new, threaded with more gray than a man not yet 35 should carry. The limp was new. The terrible puckered burn that ran from his jaw down under his collar was new. But the eyes were the same eyes that had once looked at her across a church aisle with his hand trembling around hers, and Naomi's basket slid from her fingers and struck the porch boards, and neither of them moved to pick it up. "Gabriel," she said, and her voice broke clean in half on the second syllable. He went the color of ash. For one long moment she thought he might simply turn and go back inside and bar the door, the way a man closes a coffin, and some old, humiliated part of her almost wished he would, so she would not have to stand here with 7 years of grief crawling up her throat all at once. Instead he said her name, just that, Naomi, the way a man says a prayer he has been told he no longer has the right to say. It had been a Tuesday in June when he vanished. She remembered the heat of that morning, the borrowed lace at her collar that Widow Cobb had lent her out of her own trunk, the church already filling with Millbrooks, better families come to see the blacksmith's son marry the dressmaker's apprentice. A match half the town called a triumph, and the other half called above her station, and beneath his. She remembered standing at the side door with her father's cousin, the only kin she had left to walk her in, waiting for the bell, and waiting, until Reverend Prout himself came out white-faced to say no one could find the groom, that his horse and rifle and half his belongings were gone from the smithy, and that his father Amos Lowry, deacon of the very church they stood in, a pillar the whole county had leaned on, had been taken that same hour by the marshal on charges of running false brands over stolen cattle to cover 4 years of silver claim debt. She remembered, too, the particular way the Reverend's voice had shaken as he said it, and how the whole congregation had turned as one body to look at her, still standing in the side doorway in her borrowed lace, and how her father's cousin had let go of her arm as though the disgrace might be catching, stepping half a pace away from her before he caught himself and stepped back. She had walked back down the church aisle alone, past every face she had known her whole life, and not one of them had met her eyes. The town had needed someone close at hand to be angry at, and Gabriel was not there to receive it, so it had settled on her instead. The girl fool enough to have been left standing in her wedding dress, as though loving him had been the crime, and not the leaving. She had gone home that night to a house already half-packed for a marriage that would never happen, and cried until she had no more tears in her. And then she had gone on making dresses for the very women who whispered behind their fans at her in church. She had never married. She had told herself in her most honest hours, alone with a needle and a lamp long after Widow Cobb had banked the shop fire and gone up to bed, that she was not waiting, not really, only busy, only tired. She had told herself that for 7 years, and it had never once, not for a single evening, been true. Her father had died the second winter after the wedding that wasn't, his heart simply stopping one morning over his boot mending. And it was Widow Cobb who had taken her in above the shop rather than let her keep the empty house alone. Widow Cobb who had taught her to cut a pattern true, and never once asked her to explain why she still flinched at the sound of church bells on a Tuesday. Naomi had thought, in the numb weeks after burying her father, that she had reached the bottom of what grief could take from her. She had not yet climbed Hermit's Ridge. "You should go," Gabriel said now, low and rough, not looking at her straight on. "There's nothing up here worth your climb, Naomi. There's a man up here I buried in my heart and never got to say goodbye to properly," she said, and picked her basket back up off the boards with hands that had, strangely, stopped shaking, because grief, she found, left less room for fear than anger did, and she was, to her own considerable surprise, furious. "You'll tell me what happened to you, Gabriel Lowry, or so help me I will sit on this porch until the first snow comes and freezes me to it." He looked, for just a moment, like a man who might actually smile, before the shame closed back over his ruined face like water closing over a stone thrown into a still pond. "It's a poor thing to look at now," he said, meaning himself, and turned to go inside, and this time she followed him over the threshold, because she had spent 7 years not following him and had decided, somewhere on the last switchback of that ridge, that she was entirely finished with it. He told her only a little that first afternoon, sitting stiff and wary at his own scrubbed table while she made tea in a kitchen too clean, too orderly, for a man half the county called mad. His father's ruin had not been idle talk. Amos Lowry had spent years buying cheap, sick cattle off a man running stolen stock through 3 counties, rebranding the animals and selling them on as prime beeves to cover debts from a played-out silver claim. And when the scheme came apart that June morning, it had come apart all at once, in front of the marshal and half the county waiting outside the church for a wedding. Gabriel swore he had known nothing of it, and Naomi believed him then, and believed him now. But knowing had never mattered to the men who came looking for their money, once the old man was in irons and could pay nothing back. They had found Gabriel at the smithy instead. There had been a fight, 3 men against 1, and in the scuffle a lantern had gone over into the straw, and by the time Gabriel dragged himself out from under the collapsed hayloft, his leg was crushed beneath a fallen beam, and the fire had already climbed his shoulder and up the side of his neck before he beat it out with his own bare hands. "I couldn't come to the church looking a ruin, dragging a ruined name behind me," he said, staring at the scarred backs of his own hands as though they belonged to some other, lesser man. "Couldn't put that on you, on your good name, not after everything Millbrook already thought of my father. Better you hate a coward who ran than pity a wreck who stayed and dragged you down with him." He had ridden as far as his leg would carry him that same terrible night, which turned out to be the base of Hermit's Ridge, and he had simply never left it again. 7 years he had cut wood and trapped and grown just enough in that half-tended garden to live on, and let the county believe whatever ugly story it liked about the hermit on the height, because any story the town could invent was kinder, he said, than the plain truth of what he had let himself become. "What do you do up here all these years, with no one to speak to?" she asked him, unable to keep the ache out of the question. "Trap through the winter, grow what I can in the summer, talk to the mule some evenings when the quiet gets to be too much of a company all its own." He said it plainly, without asking for her pity, and something about the flat honesty of it undid her more than any excuse could have. "There's a man comes up from the mercantile twice a year to trade for pelts. I expect he's the only soul in the county who still calls me by my given name." "I called you by it not 10 minutes ago." "You did," he said, and for the first time since she'd climbed the ridge, something almost like a smile reached all the way to his eyes before he remembered himself and looked away. "You decided all of that for both of us," Naomi said quietly. "You never once asked what I could bear." "I'm asking you to leave now," he said. "That's the only mercy I've got left in me to give you." She did not leave. She came back 3 days later with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and he did not turn her away from the door even if he would not meet her eyes across the table. And she came back the week after that with a jar of preserves, and the week after that with nothing but herself, until the trips up the ridge stopped being an act of will entirely, and became simply the shape of her Thursdays, the one fixed point around which the whole rest of her week arranged itself. One raw Thursday in October she found him at the porch rail whittling, of all things, a small wooden bird no bigger than her thumb, his scarred hand surprisingly deft with the little blade. He colored when he saw her watching and made to pocket it, but she held out her palm, and after a long moment he set the bird into it without a word. "For the mantle," he said gruffly, as though it were nothing at all, and she had to turn away toward the stove so he would not see what the small kindness did to her face. That evening, mending the shoulder seam of his one good coat by the fire while he read aloud from an old almanac in a voice gone rusty from disuse, she laughed for the first time in longer than she could easily account for, and he looked up at the sound of it, as though she had handed him something rarer than the deed itself. Reverend Prout, when she finally confessed the whole of it to him one evening on the church steps, only nodded slowly, and admitted he had known for years that the hermit of the ridge was Gabriel Lowry, having recognized him at a distance on a pastoral call not long after the fire, and chosen, out of a kind of mercy, he hoped was not cowardice of his own, to let the man keep his solitude rather than force a reckoning on him before he was ready. "I sent the boy up with wood and never once told him whose door he was knocking on," the Reverend said, "and I have wondered ever since if that was Christian charity or plain avoidance. Perhaps you've settled the question for both of us, Miss Strand." He took to riding up the switchback himself once a month after that, ostensibly to see to the man's soul, though Naomi suspected it was mostly to see how the courtship progressed. Millbrook noticed, as Millbrook always noticed everything worth noticing and a good deal that was not. Widow Cobb, who ran the dress shop with her and loved her like the daughter she'd never had, only sighed over her pins some evenings and said nothing outright, because Widow Cobb had buried 2 husbands of her own and knew better than to argue with a woman's grief, once it had finally found somewhere useful to go. It was Warren Ellis, the bank clerk who had been calling on Naomi with quiet, careful patience for 2 years, who finally said what half the town had been murmuring behind her back. "He left you standing at the altar, Naomi," Warren said one evening on the dress shop step, turning his good hat round and round in his hands the way he always did when working up to something he'd rehearsed. "Whatever's happened to him since, that's not a debt you owe him. I've got a steady place at the bank, a house nearly finished on Cedar Street, and I'm asking you plain, in front of God and this whole street if you like, marry me, and let the ridge and everything on it go, once and for all." She was fond of Warren. She would not lie to herself and say otherwise. He was decent and solid, and would never once vanish from her in the night without a word. But when she tried to picture years of Thursdays spent anywhere else at all, something in her chest went hollow and cold as a well in January, and she knew, before she had even opened her mouth, exactly what her answer would have to be. "I can't give you what a wife owes a husband, Warren," she said gently, laying her hand over his to soften what she had to say. "Not while there's a debt of my own I haven't yet finished paying." "To a man who ran," Warren said, not unkindly, only tired and a little bewildered by his own losing. "To myself," she said, "for 7 years of wondering what I might have done differently, and finding out at last that I did nothing wrong at all." He left her his hat turning and his quiet disappointment on the step, and did not call at the shop again. And Naomi told herself she had chosen rightly, even as the town's tongues sharpened around her all that autumn. The dressmaker, they said, wasting her last good marrying years climbing a ridge to feed a madman who hadn't the plain decency to marry her the first time he'd had the chance. A banker's wife came into the shop that same week for a fitting and said, not quite low enough to pretend it was private, that some women simply did not know how to accept when they had been shown mercy in being spared a ruinous match. Naomi held 3 pins between her lips and said nothing at all, only finished the hem straight and true, because Widow Cobb had taught her long ago that the sharpest answer to unkindness was work done well and a still tongue, and because she had long since stopped expecting Millbrook to understand what it had never once troubled itself to ask her directly. It was Sela's kestrel who gave Millbrook something newer to whisper about before the leaves had even finished turning. He came through town with a land agent's leather satchel and a surveyor's easy smile, buying up water rights along the Ridge Creek on behalf of a timber concern out of the capital. And he found, to his open and mounting irritation, that the choicest stretch of bottomland, the stretch with the good spring, and the stand of old-growth pine, worth more than the rest of his whole survey put together, sat squarely beneath Gabriel Lowry's cabin, on a claim that had never once been properly refiled at the county seat in the 7 years since Amos Lowry's arrest. Abandoned land, by any honest reading of the statute, Kestrel told Gabriel on the porch one gray afternoon, while Naomi stood frozen in the doorway with flour still drying on her hands. A man vanishes from his given name for the better part of a decade, lives under no clear deed anyone in the county can put a finger on. The recorder will call it open ground the moment I ask him to. And I mean to ask before the first snow closes the passes, with or without your say-so. It was my father's claim before it was ever mine, Gabriel said, his jaw tight. There is a deed filed proper the year I was born. Then find it, Kestrel said pleasantly, tipping his hat, or I'll have men up here with axes for that pine before the month is out, deed or no deed, and you're welcome to carry your grievance to whatever judge will hear a hermit's word over a filed timber concession. He tipped his hat to Naomi with a courtesy that felt very like an insult, and rode back down the switchback at his leisure, and Gabriel stood a long while on the step afterward, the old shame and a new, sharper fear moving together across his ruined face like weather. Kestrel came to call on Naomi too, only 2 days later, standing in the dress shop doorway with his surveyor's smile fixed in place, while Widow Cobb watched from the back room with her scissors held like a weapon. A dressmaker climbing that ridge every week does a hermit's cause no good, and does her own reputation less, he said pleasantly enough. Best you leave a settled matter settled, Miss Strand, and let a business concern proceed without any tender-hearted complications. She told him, in the same even voice she used for measuring a difficult customer, that she had climbed harder things than his opinion of her, and shut the door on him herself, which Widow Cobb declared afterward the finest piece of work she had done all year, finer even than the Sunday coats. Let him have it, Gabriel said at last, heavy. I've no right to fight for ground I ran off and abandoned. A man who ran from you sure as anything ran off from his own name on a piece of paper too. Naomi went to the county seat herself before she ever climbed the ridge again, and brought Reverend Prout with her for the asking, since a minister's word still carried weight with the recorder that a dressmaker's did not. The clerk paged through the county's dusty ledgers twice over, and found nothing filed under Lowry at all in the 7 years since Amos's arrest, only a notation, added some months back in Sela's Kestrel's own careful hand, marking the parcel as unclaimed and ripe for transfer come the new year. If there's a deed to be had, Reverend Prout told her gravely on the ride back. "It wants finding before Christmas, or there'll be nothing left for finding to matter." It was that same grim arithmetic that sent Naomi and Gabriel to the old trunk 2 evenings later with a lamp, and a growing sense that time itself had joined Kestrel's side of the ledger. "You listen to me now, Gabriel Lowry." Naomi set down the bread she had been kneading and crossed the small room and took his scarred hands in both of hers, the first time she had touched him at all since the church door, 7 years gone, and she did not let either the puckered burns or his flinching stop her. "You did not run from a piece of paper. You ran because you believed loving me and being broken were two things that could never live under one roof together. They can. I have spent 7 years finding that out the slow, hard way, on my own, and I will not stand here and watch you hand a stranger your father's good name on top of everything else you've already decided you don't deserve to keep." They searched 2 long evenings for the deed among Amos Lowry's old effects. A battered trunk Gabriel had never once had the heart to open, hauled up the ridge years back by a kindly neighbor who had asked no questions and expected none in return. On the second night, by lamplight, under a false bottom gone soft and swollen with old damp, Naomi's fingers found a flat tin box, and inside it, still legible in a careful, deliberate hand, the original county filing for the claim, dated the very year Gabriel was born, never once transferred out of the family name in all the years since. "It's enough," Gabriel breathed, staring at the paper as though he did not entirely trust his own eyes to hold it steady. "It's enough to hold him off, surely." It should have been. But Silas Kestrel had not ridden 200 miles chasing water rights, an old-growth pine to be turned back by a scrap of yellowed paper carried down a mountain by a jilted dressmaker. And 3 nights later, with an early-season storm blowing hard rain sideways across the whole ridge and no moon at all to see by, his hired men came up not with axes, but with coal oil, meaning to burn the old claim shack, and the trunk that proved it before any circuit judge could ever lay eyes on either. Naomi was there that particular night because she had made herself be there. She had gone to the mercantile that afternoon for thread and heard Jed Coyle, one of Kestrel's hired hands, with a conscience heavier than his wages, muttering to the stable boy that they were loading coal oil onto the wagon for the ridge job before the weather turned. She had not waited to hear more. She had borrowed Widow Cobb's own mule without so much as asking leave, formal apology to follow, and ridden hard for the switchback, with the first fat drops of the coming storm already striking her shoulders, arriving soaked to the skin and half frantic to find Gabriel calmly banking his evening fire, as though the world were not about to come apart around him. "They mean to burn it tonight," she said, gasping the words out before she was even properly through the door. "Coyle said so himself, not 2 hours past." "Then we'll sit up and watch for them," Gabriel said, reaching for his rifle, and would not hear a single word of her riding back down in such weather and such dark, not with the trail already turning to a river of mud beneath the downpour. And so she stayed, and they sat up together by the banked fire, listening to the storm build outside until neither of them could tell any more whether the thunder was in the sky or coming up through the ground itself. It was near midnight when the first crack came, too sharp and too close to be thunder at all, and Naomi was on her feet with the smell of smoke already thick in the air, Gabriel lunging up from his chair beside her, his bad leg buckling hard under him before he had gone 3 full strides toward the back of the house. "The box," he shouted, over a crack and roar already climbing the north wall where the men had thrown their oil and touched a match to it. "It's still in the trunk back there. I have to reach it before." "You will die reaching for paper," she said, but he was already gone into the thickening smoke toward the back room, dragging his ruined leg behind him, and Naomi did not stand frozen in the doorway, wondering what a sensible, careful woman ought to do in such an hour. She soaked her shawl through in the rain barrel by the door, and wound it hard over her mouth and nose, and went in after him, without another word wasted on argument. The back room was already a wall of orange light and rolling black smoke crawling low along the ceiling beams, and she found Gabriel down on his knees beside the overturned trunk, the tin box clutched hard against his chest, a fallen roof timber pinned squarely across his bad leg where the burning ceiling had begun, with a groan of old wood to give way above them. He was coughing too hard by then to form a single word. She got her shoulder under the far end of the beam and heaved with everything 9 years of hauling dress bolts and water buckets, and 7 years of a private, bank-down grief had put into her arms, and it did not move, not on the first try, nor the second, while the heat above them had begun to roar like something alive and hungry. "Naomi, go," he choked out, shoving weakly at her arm with the hand not holding the box. "Go now, while you still can." "I did not climb this ridge every single Thursday for 7 months to leave you pinned under a beam," she said, and set her shoulder to the wood a third time, crying out with the sheer effort of it. And this time it gave, rolling free just enough for him to drag his crushed leg clear of the timber. She got one arm hard up under his shoulder, and would not let herself think of the smoke closing overhead now, nor of the wall gone from orange to a blinding, roaring white, only of the door, the door, the door. And together, stumbling, half-blind, coughing until it felt as though their lungs had turned to ash, they made it out onto the wet, blessed ground of the yard as the roof came down behind them in one great collapsing roar of sparks, swallowed almost at once by the driving rain. They had not been down in the mud a full minute before the mule's terrified braying reached them from the little lean to barn nearer the fire's edge, and Naomi was up again before Gabriel could so much as call her back, running low under the smoke to haul the frightened animal's rope halter loose and drag it bodily out into the rain-soaked yard, away from a wall that gave way not 30 seconds after she cleared it. She came back to Gabriel's side breathless, her sleeve scorched through at the wrist, though she had not felt the burn happen, and knelt down hard in the mud beside him as the last of the cabin's back wall folded in on itself behind them both. They lay together in the mud a long while after, Gabriel's ruined leg bleeding fresh where the beam had torn the old scar open again, the tin box still clutched hard to his chest, both of them soaked through and shaking, and against every reasonable expectation, alive. Kestrel's men, watching from the tree line to be certain their work was done proper, had not counted on a witness capable of walking a hurt man bodily down a mountain in the pitch dark. 2 of them lost their nerve entirely before dawn and rode hard for the county seat to swear their own version first, only to tell a deputy everything once he sat them down separately and let each one hear how badly the other's account did not match his own. Naomi rode the mule down to Millbrook herself at first light to fetch the doctor, mud-caked and smoke-blackened, and past caring what the town made of the sight of her, and by noon half of Millbrook knew the whole of it. How the jilted dressmaker had pulled a burning man and his frightened mule both out from under a falling roof in the dark, and why. Widow Cobb cried into her apron at the shop counter, and then, drying her eyes, declared she would hear no more foolishness about tender-hearted complications from Silas Kestrel or anyone else, and closed the shop for the day to sit with Naomi, while the doctor set Gabriel's leg proper for the first time in 7 years. By the time the circuit judge came through Millbrook that winter, the burned claim shack, the recovered deed, and 2 hired men's sworn confessions had made short work of Silas Kestrel's water rights scheme. The judge read the old filing aloud in open court in Amos Lowry's own careful hand, dated the year of Gabriel's birth, and declared the Lowry claim sound and untouchable, and ordered Kestrel's timber concern to answer for the fire besides. Kestrel himself did not stay in the county long enough to hear the verdict read twice. He was gone west before the week was out, and no one in Millbrook troubled themselves to wonder where. It made short work, too, of Millbrook's long memory of Gabriel Lowry as a coward who had abandoned his bride at the church door. Gabriel wrote to his father that winter for the first time in 7 years, care of the territorial prison 2 counties east, a short letter that took him 3 tries and most of an evening to get right. The answer came back slow, in Amos Lowry's own shaking hand, 3 lines only, saying he had long since given up hoping for any word from his son, and would treasure this one for whatever years he had left. Gabriel read it through twice at the table, and then handed it across to Naomi without a word. And she understood, watching his face, that some debts, once a man finally stopped running from them, turned out to be smaller and far more forgivable than years of silence had made them seem. A man who dragged himself under a falling roof to save his own father's honest name, and let a woman half carry him bodily down a mountain rather than let her risk it alone, was not a story the town could go on telling the old cruel way. And to its lasting credit, once it finally saw the plain truth of things, it did not try very hard to keep telling it anyhow. Gabriel's leg healed crooked, and always would. He walked with a cane the rest of his days, and never once apologized for it again in Naomi's hearing. The scars at his jaw and throat stayed too, and she took to pressing her open palm flat against them some quiet evenings by the rebuilt fire, not to smooth them away, only to say with her hand what she had already spent 7 years, and one terrible night saying with everything else she had, that she had never once, not for a single hour of any of it, seen a ruin where the whole rest of the county had trained itself to look. Widow Cobb wept openly when Naomi finally told her the whole of it over the shop counter, and swore she had known all along, in the way of women who have buried 2 husbands and learned to read grief accurately at 50 paces. Even Warren Ellis, when the story reached him, sent up a jar of his mother's good preserves by way of a blessing, with a note that said only that he was glad, and that he hoped she would think kindly of him still, which she did, and always would. Gabriel asked her properly in March, on the same porch where she had first seen him step out with his rifle, though this time he set the rifle aside before he spoke. He had no ring to offer, only the small wooden bird he had carved that first autumn, turned over so many evenings in his own hands that its edges had gone smooth. "I've precious little to bring a wife," he said, the old shame flickering across his face one last time before he seemed to master it for good. A crooked leg, a burned name half-mended, a cabin still smelling of new lumber. "You've brought me everything I climbed that ridge looking for," she told him, closing his scarred fingers around the little bird and her own hand both. "And I'll hear no more accounting of what you lack, Gabriel Lowry, not from you, and not from this whole county besides." He kissed her then, slowly and gently, careful as a man handling something precious he still could not quite believe was truly his to keep. And he did not once mention his crooked leg or his long-ruined name again, not that whole evening, nor any evening after. They were married the following spring, not in the Millbrook church where he had once left her standing in borrowed lace, but on the porch of the newly rebuilt cabin on Hermit's Ridge itself, with Reverend Prout climbing the whole switchback himself, out of breath and beaming, to say the words properly at last, and Widow Cobb weeping happily into a lace handkerchief she'd kept folded away for just such an occasion, and half of Millbrook besides trudging up the trail to see it done right. As though the whole town meant to make up in one afternoon for 7 years of unkindness. Someone had strung early wildflowers along the porch rail, someone else had carried up a fiddle, and there was dancing on the packed dirt yard well past dark, careful and slow, to account for a groom who could not spare his leg for for anything faster. Naomi wore no borrowed lace this second time, only her own plainest good dress, the one she had sewn herself with steady hands, because she had learned by then that a wedding day was never the thing worth keeping. Only the staying afterward was, the long chain of ordinary Thursdays and hard winters, and the one hand that had refused, in the end, to let go twice. I looked for you a long time without ever admitting I was looking, she told him that evening, her head resting against his shoulder, the ridge gone gold and hushed below them in the last low light. His cane leaned within easy reach against the porch rail, where it would stay the rest of both their lives, and the small carved bird set on the windowsill, where the morning sun would find it first. And I would climb every one of those switchbacks again, every single time in any weather at all, just to find you exactly like this, broken and stubborn and mine, and finally, after everything, entirely home.